16, chapter 16, part 3, the last part here. We're talking about urban sprawl, which is another feature of the third wave, or the modern wave of urbanization. So, suburban or urban sprawl, and I kind of gave away my next little line here. You see the growth of suburbs. You see cities expanding but becoming less dense. So, jobs move out of the city and people move out of the city. And so, what you have are polycentric cities. In the 1800s in Chicago, you had downtown Chicago and then the neighborhoods around it. And that was it for the way the city was. It had one center. But as the city grew larger and suburbs grew up, so you can live, and there is still downtown Chicago with lots of shopping, but there's also shopping districts in Lincoln Square and in Skokie and in Schaumburg and in Oak Park. All these little kind of mini centers of urban activity. So cities now have these many little separate centers, if you will. And this is in large part due to auto transport, because we can drive places. We did have trains before, but automobiles really make the difference. And I remember I showed you before when we talked about the impact of cars on cities, how big Chicago grew in the 1950s. Well, there is a negative aspect to this. I mean, yes, you lose environments or habitats for animals when you build roads, but automobile exhaust is the single biggest source of air pollution in the United States every year. There's actually more pollution from cars overall than factories, and especially in the suburb where you don't have a very dense settlement. In the city of Chicago, there are many neighborhoods where you do not need a car. You can walk to the grocery store, you can walk to work, or take the train. The city is very dense. There's a lot of people living close together. But in the suburbs, right, you have everyone living in a single family home. It's more spread out with bigger yards. You have to drive everywhere. If you've ever been out to the suburbs, you know exactly what I mean. I grew up out in the suburbs of Green Bay, Wisconsin. There were no sidewalks where we lived because no one walked. So that has negative aspects. You need a car to live out in the suburbs, okay? Which means that for this type of urban structure to last, and think about this, we've been living in cities since roughly about, say, 4,000 years now, right? So to live this way for another 4,000 years, it's not really sustainable because at some point, as we've talked about, we're going to run out of cheap fuel. It's going to be hard to drive cars for, $2.50, what is it now, $1 a gallon of gas. So if you have a situation where people can't afford to own their own car, it's going to make living in an environment like a suburb where you need that very undesirable. And also, we've also seen that people are just increasingly concerned with the environment and realize this. The last aspect, unfortunately, of the modern wave of urbanization are slums. So slums are unplanned and informal housing. And what that means by informal is, in a lot of countries in the world, the housing, as you see here in St. Vincent, this is housing that was built on the side of a hill. It wasn't the best place to build a house, but that's why they're there. We'll talk about why in a little bit. But unplanned, there's no sewer lines out here. So there's nowhere for the sewage, so people have to just have an outhouse. There's no plumbing. If you notice, there's no streets or electricity grids. So it's unplanned. It wasn't put in with the city's planning. It's illegal. The people who live here may not own the land. They just found a place that no one else would bother them and they built a house. So it's unplanned. The United Nations defines slums as, one, they don't have safe water. They maybe have it, but it's very hard to get to. Unlike in the most of the United States, for the most part, and there are exceptions, you can go and turn on your tap and get clean water. It's pretty hard to imagine a major American city not having decent drinking water for an amount of time. That's why it's so shocking that it happened in Flint. But for the most part, the vast majority have access to safe water. Secondly, access to sanitation and the infrastructure, so sewage lines. And think about it. If your house didn't have sewage lines or working sewers when you flushed, right? If you had a whole neighborhood like that, you'd have a huge issue. But also garbage pickup, street cleaning, that kind of a thing. Third aspect, the houses tend to be poor structural quality. And that's not a reflection on the builders. It's a reflection on it's usually built by people who can't afford good material. So they build with what they can. So it may look ramshackle. These may look like shacks. And that's not because the people who built them are stupid. It's because they could afford to build a nicer house. And then the last thing, very important, insecure residential status. So a lot of slums, the people who live there don't own the land their houses are on. In a sense, they're squatters. Or it's not even recognized. They never got a permit to build here. And so what happens is it's very easy for a government to go in and destroy these houses because technically they're not supposed to be there. The people who live here have very little recourse. If they demand sewer service or electricity, the city can say, well, you don't own the land, why should we provide you service? So these things all combine for a slum. Now let me just be clear. When I say slums in this text and in this context, we are talking about slums that meet this definition. I've had students ask me before, what about like Chicago's neighborhoods? We have some slum neighborhoods. We do have some disadvantaged neighborhoods. I'm not going to deny that. But it's not the same level of slum. And that's not to diminish that what we have in Chicago is bad. It is. But we're talking about a much different aspect in most of the world. So for our usage of this word, I'm going to go by what the UN says. So we see this happening. It's a large part of the urban growth in the developing world. The countries of the world that are growing fastest, the developing world. So countries sub-Saharan Africa like Nigeria or Uganda or Mozambique. Countries in Asia like Bangladesh or Pakistan, right? Their cities are growing and they're seeing a large amount of this. One of the reasons is as these cities grow, right? So the capital, one of the largest cities in the world is Lagos in Nigeria. And as it grows, people are coming in from the country to find work. And there's not a lot of good work. So what happens is they don't have the money to live in a decent place, right? We've had this discussion, I think, many times in class. No one lives, and pardon my French, in a shitty neighborhood because you want to. No one lives in a slum because they want to. It's because they don't have a choice, right? I've said this before. If you don't really have an ability to choose a good place to live, then really is it a choice? You just live where you can. And so that's how slums arise. The market, it's too expensive for decent housing, so they have to live in substandard housing. Or the country. Some countries, housing is very tightly controlled. Who gets to build what? Whatever happens, as populations increase, adequate housing is not available. That leads to the development of slums. And in these slums, we often see poor living conditions because these are not planned. They're kind of put up ramshackle. They don't have access to sewer lines or water. So here is one here, and I believe this one here is in Manila. After a rain, all the garbage gets washed out into the street. Well, that can't be very healthy. A lot of these buildings are built in very unsafe reasons. People build what they can. Okay. Again, vulnerable resident status. People here don't have a lot of legal protection. Now, some slums actually make the transition and become a city neighborhood. This is in Mexico City. It's part of Mexico City called Ciudad Neza. It was originally a slum built over an old dried up lake back in the 1920s and 30s. But the people that were there organized, and to overcome the vulnerable status, they organized, they petitioned the government, they got electricity to be rerouted, they got schools to be built. And as it became a part of the city and more recognized as such, they were able to upgrade the housing. And today it's actually one of the most vibrant neighborhoods in the city of Mexico City. So it can happen. Okay. And so what the book is talking to say with this is that there are a variety of slums. It isn't either yes or no. Some slums are extremely horrible. Slums of hope to slums of despair. I'm going to show you this website. I'm not going to explore it too much. Let's click on it. Turn up my pointer here. This live link, is in the PowerPoint, so you can access it. I'm also going to make it available in there. Some interesting things here. So you can scroll through it on your own, and it goes through these different slums in different parts of the world. So there's a little bit of an article, some pictures, some videos to watch. Talks about it right here. So you scroll through, and let's go to the first one, Nairobi. Right, Liberia. And I've actually shown you a picture of slum tours in Siberia earlier in the semester. So you can see there's where it ends, and you can see that's planned, and this is not. And you can see the difference, right? And so this goes through a little bit of how the slum arose and some of the issues it faces. Um, some maps right here. This is the one in Mexico City I was talking about. Ciudad Neza, right? So it was able to develop, but you look at, if I can find the picture in here, that's the difference in the slum, right? These are built with pieces of plywood and metal they can find. Children often don't have education. It's right in the middle of a rail line. So a lot of issues. I'm going to leave this again. Let me close that. You can click on it here, or I'll make the link available. So let's finish up looking at this urbanization in the United States with this idea of megalopolis. It's not an official city. Megalopolis is this region on the east coast of the United States. It goes from Maine all the way through Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and then Washington, all the way to Richmond, Virginia, about 600 miles. Okay, so area-wise, okay, not that big, but it contains 14% of our country's population is right here. So that's a decent chunk. New York is the biggest city in the country at about, I think, 9 or 10 million people. Philly's not too tiny. Boston's pretty good. All these counties in orange are what they consider urban. So that means that a large amount, I think it's like 75% of the population, lives in cities. So if you drive through this area or take the train or fly, it's pretty much city the whole way. It's not that you're not going to see open space, but it's few and far between. I think the closest example I can think of here is if you drive to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. If you guys go to Milwaukee, or if you drive over to, say, maybe Detroit, you are in city for a long time. There's patches here and there, but pretty much it. Okay. But what's interesting in this is kind of a case study. It's got some interesting things. It is largely suburban. So even though not that large and a lot of people, outside of the cities of New York and Philadelphia, the cities themselves, a lot of these counties are extremely suburban. So suburban sprawl is just a much lower density, right? But interesting fact, or kind of an odd thing too, one of the things we find in large cities is increasing ethnic and racial diversity. So in Megalopolis, the population is about a little over 20% black, almost 9% Asian, and almost 20% Hispanic. And that's what only in there. Compare that to the rest of the country. The average U.S. blacks are only 12.5% of the population. Hispanics are less than 5. Or I'm sorry, Asians are less than 5, and Hispanics are 16.3%. So there's much more diversity within these areas. Okay. It's also a destination for immigrants. Most immigrants to this country, when they come in through a large city like New York or Philadelphia, and they stay there and work. You have large communities of immigrants in these areas. Chicago is also like that too. We have a large Hispanic population and a large, actually, Chinese and Asian population of immigrants as well. So the foreign-born population, right, interesting, has really changed. In the 1960s, only 10% of the people of Megalopolis were born outside the United States, but today, or even this is 10 years ago, it's even higher now, almost a quarter. But what's interesting is that we've seen another trend, and that is that the population that are immigrants traditionally would usually come and live in a big city first, like New York, and then their children would move to the suburbs. But today, that's actually not happening. We're seeing it both. We're seeing immigrants move directly to the suburbs now, and that's a new trend. So, all right. That's all we've got for you. Again, these chapter summary notes are going to be really helpful coming up for your midterm and your final. And that's all I've got for you. Thank you much. Have a good day.